I'm Anthony Gale, and you're listening to Rights and Wrongs, a weekly podcast by Human Rights Watch. 2015 saw Myanmar hold its first openly contested elections in 25 years. Unsung Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy won a landslide victory. But Myanmar's dance towards democracy was short-lived. 2 years ago, a military junta seized power and ousted the democratic leader. She was abruptly thrown in prison. Understandably, the coup d'etat was met with widespread protests, but these have been brutally put down. Violence is now commonplace. Thousands of people have been detained, tortured, even killed. According to some estimates, as many as 6,000 people have been killed since the junta seized power. Earlier this week, there were two important developments in Myanmar's constitutional story. Firstly, the military reportedly released Aung San Suu Kyi from jail and placed her under house arrest. Secondly, and far more worryingly, the junta extended the state of emergency, breaking the promise it made 2 years ago to hold democratic elections this month. So what does this mean for the country? Does Aung San Suu Kyi's release offer a glimmer of hope for democracy, or is the extension of the state of emergency just another nail in the coffin of Myanmar's democratic dream? To discuss this, I'm joined by Manny Mong, Human Rights Watch Myanmar researcher. Manny, welcome.
Thank you, Anthony.
Many heralded the elections in 2015 as a new beginning for the country after what was effectively decades of military rule. As somebody who grew up in Myanmar and left, what did the 2015 elections and perhaps the idea of democracy mean for you and the people around you?
I'll be really honest. To begin with, we were really skeptical. I mean, this is like decades of military rule, and I don't think anyone at the time really thought that the military would allow credible and fair elections to happen. They were the first and really only competitive elections in memory. So leading up to it, people were a little bit skeptical, cynical, if you will. But then slowly, as it transpired that, perhaps these were really going to happen and they were going to allow for whoever was elected by the people to be allowed to lead, that sense of hope and that sense of urgency really started to gain traction and grow. And I was covering the elections for a news outlet at the time, and honestly, being part of such a movement, both as a Burmese person and being in the thick of it as part of my job, I couldn't help but also be swept away by the emotion and really the dream that people had been seeking for so long.
It's very difficult to talk about Myanmar without touching upon the horrors that were meted out against the Rohingya by the military. Do you think to some extent that the air of impunity they've enjoyed around this horrendous, effectively a genocide, do you think that's impacted or aided them in taking control of the country?
Absolutely. And this is why it is so important to get a concerted international response on the military. They've enjoyed 7 decades of impunity, in fact, because, even before the 2017 crisis, there were many groups of people who were reporting on the military's atrocities in parts of the country. But certainly because of the lack of pressure that they felt and the impunity that they do enjoy, even to this day, it has emboldened them, and it continues to embolden them to the point where they can completely contravene their own constitution that they wrote in 2008 and extend, another 6 months of a state of emergency when actually the constitution that they wrote says they can only do it twice. So this is obviously showing just how arbitrary in nature the military's actions are. But in being so arbitrary, they feel that they can because they're not feeling the heat from us right now.
Sadly, Myanmar's democratic experiment was short-lived, and we saw a couple of years ago there was a coup, and understandably there were widespread protests in response to this. Did you expect to see the level of brutality in how those protests were put down?
Unfortunately, once people started taking to the streets to peacefully protest, yes, we expected the extent of the brutality, because Myanmar is effectively part of an authoritarian region that does not allow for peaceful protests like this to go unpunished. After weeks of people taking to the streets, when we started seeing the tanks rolling out, we were holding our breath for when the first person was going to be killed.
Obviously, it was incredibly difficult for protesters at the time, but what we've seen subsequently is widespread violence, widespread crackdowns. I mean, what is life like for pro-democracy activists in Myanmar today?
So most pro-democracy activists are in hiding. I think there's something like 70,000 people who fled alone just over the Thai-Myanmar border. And those are very, very, conservative estimates. There's something like 60,000 others who are at the Myanmar-India border. But in terms of those widespread crackdowns, if you were seen to be even a supporter of the opposition, you are very likely going to be targeted by the military, and not just on the streets, but they will come to your house. They'll come at night. They will do these night raids where they will come searching for you. And if they don't find you and you are a person of interest, they will arrest your family. So we've seen whole families, grandmothers, parents, children of the people who they are after be arrested and taken into detention. That is the level of oppression that the military is willing to, take out on their own people.
I mean, I can't imagine what life's like for the people who are effectively being bombarded by their own government. I mean, do you have any contact with the people that are effectively being shelled?
It's really dangerous for them to be doing any normal day-to-day activity effectively. I've heard stories about people having to run more than once from one safe location to another area, which they think is a safe location, and then meanwhile in between, being attacked by the ground and air. But right now, people are just worried about their safety. They're worried about putting food on the table. They're worried about how their children will get education. And with food, we know that, again, the military has been blocking humanitarian aid, but they can't even go out to harvest their own crops. They can't go out to grow their own rice because they're afraid of this constant threat of the military coming to attack them. So Myanmar is a mainly agricultural society, and it's very common for people who live out in the rural areas to also plant their own rice and their own subsistence living. And right now, no one can do that because once they go out, they may be mistaken for being an opposition fighter, or actually, in some cases, in places like Shan State and Karenni State, we've heard that people who have gone out to try and plant food either then have been used by the military themselves to plant food for them, or then maybe even taken as porters and used as human shields later.
And I think what's quite telling about the situation in Myanmar is that we're not hearing a huge amount about it. There doesn't seem to be a lot of information getting out, like, for example, what we were just discussing now. I mean, why is there this almost information black hole around the country?
It's not necessarily because we're not trying to get the information out or people aren't trying to get the information out. We've had a couple of major incidents in other parts of the world, namely Ukraine, that sucks a lot of oxygen out of the room, particularly in terms of foreign policy and news coverage. And probably mainly so because it is in a European part of the world. However, the other thing that's really contributing and probably mainly contributing to the reason why there's a bit of a lack of information coming out of Myanmar is because there are rolling internet outages. There's been internet outages in parts of the country since about 2017, but after the coup and a few weeks after the coup, actually, the military quickly cottoned on that the internet was a way for dissenters to be uploading what was happening to them and showing the level of brutality that was happening to them. So they've simply shut down the communications, which is why we don't see as much on television anymore.
And with the sort of issues with communications, what impact does that have on how you do your work?
It's massively restricting. It's slowed down my research and it's incredibly frustrating. So we cannot speak on the mobile networks anymore, so from a cell phone to a cell phone, because we do know that there's live intercept technology occurring. And we don't want to be responsible for somebody accidentally speaking to us and then being picked up by the military. So we are reduced in effect in the way that we communicate. And, we are reliant on internet networks that are very patchy, and people take great risk to go and get us information. So on the odd occasion that we do get images of, say, an airstrike or the aftermath of an airstrike or a mass murder, a killing by the military, when we get these images, it should be known that people take extreme risks to get them out of the country.
I mean, you say risks. I mean, do you worry about the safety of the people that support our work?
Absolutely. We're very careful about how we speak to people inside the country. We're very careful about how we disseminate the information. And we're very, very rigorous about who we get it from, how we get it, and where and when it's coming. So I do not ask people to take risks because I cannot vouch for their safety. But when we do receive images, we have ways to verify, perhaps if it's come through a second party or a trusted source. So we do rely a lot on our digital information lab and our digital forensics to be able to give us that corroborating information that we would have gotten previously by actually being there ourselves and being a witness ourselves.
Look, it's not just human rights organisations that are struggling to operate in Myanmar. The ability of humanitarian organisations is also incredibly hampered. What impact is this having on what is a burgeoning humanitarian crisis in the country?
Well, I mean, it's hampered because it's being actively blocked by the military. The military are key to this. They are not allowing humanitarian aid to reach the neediest people. There were always challenges with getting humanitarian aid to particularly, far off or difficult to reach areas. But in this instance, the responsibility solely lies on the military blocking aid. And then in that context, we have a humanitarian crisis that's fueled by the human rights crisis that the military junta has created. So it's all on them.
Just to go back quickly to the bigger picture, to the big news we saw or heard this week, and it was twofold. Obviously, Unsung Suu Kyi has been released from prison. Reportedly, she's now under house arrest. She's had some pardons, but also on the flip side of that, you've seen the junta, who promised elections in this month, this year, have extended the state of emergency. I mean, is Aung San Suu Kyi's release a glimmer of hope for democracy? Or, as I believe a senior diplomat said, is it just a cosmetic move on the part of the junta?
Well, I would say it's a tactical ploy, and it's a strategy that we have seen time and time again, where the Myanmar military will use things like concessions or clemencies to curry favour, particularly from their regional allies. And in this instance, what they did was they delayed elections, which we would never have supported anyway. They were sham elections, and the people of Myanmar voted for their government in 2020 already, and they were not allowed to have their voted government in power. So the military then tries to buy time, and they say we're going to extend the state of emergency. And they know that that's going to be a very unpopular thing to do, and they will get retaliation. So they deflect, and then they say that they're going to shave some years off Aung San Suu Kyi's convictions. Now, none of that is genuine, and it's done solely for the purpose of deflecting any negative reactions from the international community. Perhaps some international pressure is working for them to do this because they know that it's unpopular. But in honesty, I don't think it does anything to show that they are legitimate in working back their many, many violations.
I mean, it's interesting you mention the international community because earlier this year, Thailand held informal talks with the junta. Malaysia's, I believe the Prime Minister recently called for governments in the region to do similar informal talks. How concerned should we be that regional governments are potentially looking to normalise relationships?
That's a really good question, Anthony. We should be very, very worried about the normalization of the junta being in power. And unfortunately, the longer that this crisis is protracted, it works in the junta's favor to normalize them being in power. I also am really wary about those bilateral discussions between Thailand and Myanmar because it totally undermines the ASEAN bloc, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which Thailand and Myanmar are both a part of. What's meant to happen generally is that they work on consensus, the ASEAN bloc, and they've decided as a bloc to actually diplomatically isolate Myanmar and not invite Myanmar to their regular summits that they hold. But in this instance, Thailand has sidestepped that and invited them bilaterally to discuss whatever. We don't know for sure because they were opaque conversations that they had. And it seems like we don't really want individual countries going rogue when what's needed right now is a concerted, coordinated effort to hold the military accountable.
And I think what's quite interesting is at the same time that you have countries like Malaysia making these remarks, in the last 3 months, I believe there's been a doubling of airstrikes, a lot of them on civilians. Why isn't more being done by international bodies to hold the junta and leaders to account?
So if I was a cynical diplomat, I would say that it's not possible because Russia and China both sit on the UN Security Council. As it stands, we know that Russia and China are two of the biggest countries that sell weapons directly to Myanmar. And we've actually identified several of their helicopters and jets being used in these airstrikes on civilians. So it's very difficult to get traction from the UN Security Council on this. We've really pushed them to try and at least get a resolution to a place where we can say refer the situation or refer the country's situation to the International Criminal Court, and at the very least put in an arms embargo that is, enforceable. That's the key, because right now we have several different countries, mainly Western countries, who have put in sanctions on key individuals and businesses and entities that do business with Myanmar. But it's not really enforced and it's not coordinated. So these are the key things that we need to really see here. And that's not happening.
I liked what you said about cynical diplomats. I think in any of these very large macro contexts, it's very easy to focus on the bigger picture, the geopolitics. I mean, what do you think Burmese people want to see from the international community? What should governments be doing to support the people on the ground?
Burmese people have said what they want. They said very early on that they wanted stronger international pressure. They wanted targeted sanctions, some of which have happened, but not from the regional parties, which I think would make a significant impact on the military's ability to have diplomatic ties. And now Myanmar people are saying, why has the world forgotten us? Why aren't they paying attention when, as you say, airstrikes have doubled in some areas? I've been looking at the airstrikes data, and usually rainy season, which is on now, they would abate somewhat, but they haven't. They're continuing, and they're continuing all over the country, not just in particular areas. So Myanmar people are fed up. They're tired. It's been 2.5 years. I think the only thing driving this resistance is the people themselves inside the country. And really, the answer lies with them. But we need to do more to support them because they are tired. They are hungry. They've been cut off from communications. They've been cut off from getting necessary aid. Apart from food, they don't have medicines. They don't have access to education. They don't have access to information from the outside. It's a very isolating and demoralizing experience.
Finally, I think what we've been trying to grasp with here is obviously it's a very, very complex and difficult and terrible situation in Myanmar. But I think really the question we want to ask and sort of grapple with is the hope of democracy in Myanmar still alive?
I think so. I'm probably one of the few people you'll speak to who's still very hopeful. And I take a great sense of energy from the fact that Myanmar's youth have not given up, that they're still fighting, that they're still placing so much pressure on the military that in some ways, the military has had to take steps back. And if we do look at the way that they've shaved off some of the years of Unsung Suu Kyi's convictions, it could be due to that. So we have to give it the benefit of doubt. And, for a country that has really not had any access to democracy for so many years, the conviction in which people in Myanmar feel about their right to having democracy and having their right to elect their chosen government, it's so heartening, and it gives me so much, like I said, energy to keep going with what I do. But it is at an impasse. We are really in this holding pattern now. And I do worry that to call another 6 months of a state of emergency, we know that that means that there's going to be another 6 months more of this massive crisis of, atrocities that do amount to crimes against humanity and war crimes being committed against civilians in Myanmar. So I'm bracing for that, but I'm still really, really hopeful that we can help Myanmar get back on the path to democracy.
Well, it's reassuring to hear so much hope, because I think when you do read about Myanmar, it is often, very, very disheartening. So it's great that we've been able to end on a positive. Thank you so much for spending the time and sharing your insights. It's been a fantastic conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, Anthony.
You have been listening to Rights and Wrongs, a new podcast by Human Rights Watch. Our producers are Lisa Marie Meyer, Christina Varganova, Blair Palmer and Devon Schwartz. Our engineer is Kosi Ogbully. I'm Anthony Gale. In next week's episode of Rights and Wrongs, we'll be discussing the ongoing crisis in Sudan. Please join us again then. Goodbye for now.